Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Happy July 4th. Make sure you follow and subscribe to this podcast. And if you find the contents of the episode informative, please give the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating and take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. And also, I put a July 4th piece up at Campus Reform, so go to campusreform.org, check it out. I also have links to Campus Reform on the PAS Report website, so visit pasreport.com. In the piece, I go through and explain how the far-left ideologues, they've hijacked our educational institutions. They push false narratives about our history, and this is why so many Americans have no understanding of our founding, our values, our principles, the importance of concepts of liberty and freedom. For too long, we have allowed the left to push a false narrative. Anti-American sentiment, it permeates our educational institutions, especially college campuses, and it distorts perspectives that use this false narrative, wrongly portraying America as inherently racist and oppressive. This piece exposes the flaws in that narrative. And they want to simplistically depict the country as being dominated by privileged white men. I refuse to allow our history to be commandeered and reduced to this simplistic dichotomy, oppressor versus oppressed. This distortion intentionally overlooks the intricate dynamics that shaped our journey as a nation, perpetuating a cycle of ignorance that seeks to further factionalize our society, corrodes the progress and stability we worked so hard to achieve. And this July 4th, we have to begin to get back to our roots. We have to learn about the founders that we never talk about. We have to learn about our rich history, our culture. If we do that, then perhaps we have a chance. But this ignorance, unfortunately, the ignorance that exists about our country, our constitution, the role of government, it's also led to unchecked abuses of powers within government, allowing our institutions to become politically weaponized. It has real-world consequences, and we now live in a chilling reality. When the very bedrocks of our country, the most powerful institutions, the most influential institutions, when they succumb to political weaponization, understand the very fabric of our republic faces an existential threat. It's why I'm bringing in retired FBI Supervisory Intelligence Analyst and a courageous whistleblower, George Hill. George served his country with honor and distinction. He's worked in the intelligence field for the last 30 years in a variety of capacity. He is a great guy, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I think that we all need to recognize the amount of evidence of the corruption that exists within our government is overwhelming. Yet people still want to bury their heads in the sand. They still want to deny it. I did a whole episode last week about that. And when I put it out, people criticized, saying that there's no evidence of corruption. There's no evidence of Biden's corruption. There's no evidence of cover-up, which is just wrong. But George, I am so happy to have you here because it is people like you that give me some sense of optimism, of righting the wrongs that we are currently witnessing here. So I want to welcome you to the program. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me.
No, thank you for coming on because there is so much to unpack. We focus a lot on the recent weaponization of our political institutions, especially powerful institutions. We're talking law enforcement. We're talking intelligence. This weaponization, it had to begin somewhere. It didn't just spring up out of nowhere because Donald Trump was elected in 2016. It started long before this, and it began somewhere. I think our starting point could be 9/11. Can you explain to the audience how 9/11 really changed the dynamics of the intelligence and law enforcement communities?
Sure. I mean, it was a sea change across society. And I believe in my heart that all the changes that we adopted after 9/11 were done with good intentions. I don't think there was just some evil guy sitting there with an eye patch stroking a Persian cat, rubbing his hands together, hoping to get us to this place that we're at today. But here we are. So right after 9/11, when George Bush evacuated to Camp David, he met with Bob Mueller, I believe within 1 or 2 days afterwards. And part of the conversation, this is well documented. This is, when I testified in front of Congress, they kind of tried to drill me on it. It's published in multiple books. Bob Mueller was queried by George Bush, and President Bush said, "Bob, I know you're going to catch these guys, but what are you going to do to stop the next one?" And that set everything in motion. There certainly would have been a 9/11 commission, even if that conversation hadn't taken place. But Bob Mueller took it to heart that challenge from the President of the United States to stop the next upcoming attack. And so that gave birth to the 9/11 Commission, which then led itself to a series of discussions as they were formulating their report, whether or not they wanted to create a domestic intelligence service. And the discussion was primarily centered on, do we want an American version of MI5, or do we want, which is I'm just going to use MI5 in the conversation just for the sake of brevity. Do we want an MI5, or do we want to give the FBI this capability? And what people today don't know, even in the FBI, is that the FBI, when it got this intelligence capability, these intel analysts, 0132 job series, do not belong to the FBI. They belong to the Directorate of National Intelligence, the DNI, another post 9/11 construct. So when they gave the FBI this capability, they almost doubled in size the number of personnel carrying FBI credentials. Analysts do not have badges. They have primarily all the same authorities that an agent would have, short of making an arrest. They don't have tactics training. They don't have firearms training. But everything else is very similar. In fact, they go through school together for a large portion of the class in Quantico. And we might get back to that later. But that opened the floodgates of money to the FBI to the tune of 63 senior executive positions, all of which were occupied by 1811 job series law enforcement. These are the guys and gals with the guns and the badges. And the FBI stumbled for about maybe 3 years after that. I joined the FBI in 2010 after leaving the National Security Agency. So between 2010 and 2012, Bob Mueller had instituted something called the SAPR, the Statistical Analytical Program Review, which was mirrored off of what Giuliani and, you helped me out last time, help me out again. Who did that?
Bernie Carrick.
Bernie Carrick, sorry. I mean, no disrespect to Mr. Carrick. And he did that for about 2 years. And then this other gentleman came aboard by the name of Dave Slendorf, and who brought in McKinsey and Company. And if anybody's familiar with the global war on terror and the work that McKinsey did in that, and their PowerPoint presentations would give anybody a seizure just looking at, they put upon the FBI this program. Let me just bring it up here because I want to make sure I get the nomenclature correct. So they brought up what's called integrated program management, and that came into the Bureau around 2012. And I'm an ISO 9000 auditor. The integrated program management is essentially manufacturing performance metrics out of whole cloth, out of thin air. And let me stop there because I don't want to get too far down in the weeds and cause your listeners to start dropping off.
Well, there's a couple of important points that you hit on there. So first, we do have to recognize that this was the largest expansion of government that the country's ever witnessed. We've never seen a growth of this size take place in that short period of time, and that's exactly what it did. Whenever you're increasing bureaucrats, I always get nervous because to me, very few things can come good of that. But initially, the intent was a noble intent. I mean, listen, I get it. I understand it. 9/11 was traumatic for so many of us that actually were watching the television screens, those in New York City that actually lived through it, or the Pentagon over in Virginia, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So it was a traumatic event. But the reality is that in a free society, you carry certain risks, right? So if we look at a country like North Korea or a country like China, you don't see a lot of terror attacks because they're police states. Here in the United States, it's different. Now, one of the things that came out of 9/11 was that the agencies, the FBI, CIA, NSA, the military, they were going to be allowed to share information and share data. It was completely understandable when you learned in 9/11 that every agency had bits and pieces of information, but it was incomplete. Now, if we could put all the pieces of the puzzle together, perhaps then it would have been prevented. Once we knocked down the walls between the agencies, how did that change the dynamics in the national security apparatus of the United States?
It didn't improve our security at all. They created NCTC at that same time, National Counterterrorism Center. In my 10 years at the Bureau, and then prior to that, the National Security Agency, I only had one instance where I saw, and I can't get into it here, where I saw the apparatus, post 9/11 apparatus constructed that actually resulted in an investigation. The individual was killed in a shootout with the JTTF in Boston, but and then there were subsequent arrests of people around him in his sphere, but one arrest. That's it. And they talk about it at the FBI Academy because it's the only one. So we subordinated all of our constitutional rights to create this fusion of all the various intelligence entities, so we could have this flow of information going back and forth for one case that they highlight at the FBI Academy.
So now, as we move on in time, we see the NSA and its PRISM program, where it's capturing the metadata of every single American. And we begin to start seeing abuses. The CIA was monitoring sitting senators of the Intelligence Committee and their activities. We saw repeated spying. Obviously, then you go into the Russian collusion, the FBI opening investigation into a presidential candidate, not giving them a defensive briefing on what's going on. And so we begin to see it become extremely politicized. When did it start becoming politicized? It's not like it just happened overnight.
Right. So my assessment is that started after the decline of ISIS. When ISIS was actually gaining territory throughout the Middle East, and we saw Iraq essentially almost becoming completely engulfed by ISIS. When the Trump administration took down ISIS, and let me just back up for 1 second. It's our current commander-in-chief who botched the status of forces agreement with the newly formed Iraqi government, which gave us ISIS. So a lot of people forget that.
Yeah. They were JV team, remember?
Yeah. This is the adults being back in charge. So when ISIS collapsed, we still had this huge mechanism in the country to defend against international terrorism. And Islam goes through these cycles every couple hundred years where you have these extremist, Wahhabist, fundamentalists, and they kind of cause trouble. And then eventually they die off. And it's been going through these cycles since Muhammad, first stepped onto the world scene. So terrorism is by and large, as an international threat, has fallen off. And don't just take my word for it. There are other people out there who live in this sphere all the time, both in academia and in the government, will say essentially the same thing I'm saying. Well, we've got this gravy train, but the threat now has been diminished. I don't want to lose my pension. I don't want to lose my salary. I don't want to lose my power, because now there are people with the eye patch and the Persian cat really enjoying this. So as ISIS declined, while at the same time Trump was becoming problematic for the Democrat Party, well, where do we focus these resources? And the whole idea of white supremacy becoming a national threat, to which Director Wray has even said is the greatest threat facing our country. The president has said it multiple times. There's no data out there to support that. And they have massaged the data that they do have with the January 6th investigation by opening up cases all around the country for an event that took place in Washington, D.C. Not how the FBI and DOJ does things until January 7th.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I find, this idea of white supremacy, and I constantly say this over and over again, if we're talking about the Italian mafia, the FBI has the flowcharts. They know who the boss is, the underboss, the capos, the soldiers, who the command and control structure, the operational capabilities. Same thing with terror organizations, right? They know who's in charge of Al-Qaeda. Even if we kill a leader, another lieutenant's going to come and take the place, and we know who the next one in line is. So we have these operational flowcharts, and they actually release them quite often. Yet when it comes to this idea of white supremacy, they don't give out names of the organizations. And when I say that, I mean, they don't specifically point to organizations. Here's the leader, here are the underlings, here's what they're capable of, and here's what the American people should look out for. So if we look back to 9/11 again, after the 9/11, we got the See Something, Say Something campaign, where we alerted the public, hey, if you see someone in 90-degree weather wearing a winter coat and wires are hanging out, you may want to reach out to a law enforcement officer, because that's not normal. With this amorphous threat of white supremacy, they don't release any information. And so how big of a threat is it? And as you just said, that they overinflate the numbers, but there was billions of dollars at stake within the government bureaucracy. If Islamic terrorism is no longer the primary threat to the United States, they have to find something to replace it with. And that's where it now morphed into targeting of Americans. Is that correct?
That's my assessment. And it's not quite as simplistic as that. It's not perfectly linear. You still have people in the federal government, especially in elected positions, that don't want to deconstruct the post 9/11 construct for fear that something may happen and their constituency is going to say, you caused this, you brought that plane down, you're responsible for these deaths. And to your point, when I was in the national security sphere, I'm an old man. I joined the Marine Corps in 1976, did 13 years active duty Marine Corps and another 13 in the Navy Reserve post 9/11. Back in my day, during the Cold War, national security meant the continuity of the Constitution of the United States and the continuance of the United States as a sovereign nation. After 9/11, George Bush started this narrative that no American shall die. That was never the national security criteria, but yet it remains as such today for a number of people. So the point I'm trying to make is there are multiple people in positions of power, both elected and appointed, that look at the current state of affairs that we're in from different perspectives, but the end result is the same in that the mechanism still continues to either keep people in power, to keep money flowing, or so that people can go back to their constituencies and say, hey, no 9/11 happened on my watch. So it's multifaceted, but the groundwork was all laid in September of 2001.
And the biggest victim has been our Constitution, our fundamental rights, our God-given liberties. And I want to take up that point after a quick break. I want to talk about what is the proper role of government? And do we have too much of an expectation that government could solve all the problems? So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Hang tight. P.A.S. report listeners, hurricane season is almost here, and the time to prepare is right now, not when the hurricane hits. When Hurricane Ida hit the Gulf Coast, it destroyed countless homes and left many without access to food and clean water. Millions lost power, some for weeks. The floods that followed the hurricane washed out roads, made it impossible for grocery stores to restock their shelves. Families were desperate. They were waiting for help that was slow to arrive. But what if you didn't have to rely on FEMA to provide for your family during a crisis? The answer is simple. Be prepared with emergency food kits from 4 Patriots. Their long-lasting and delicious food options are specifically designed to provide you and your loved ones with the sustenance you need when you need it most. And these food kits are hand-packed in the USA, last up to 25 years, compact inside covert storage totes, include a wide variety of delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and they're backed by thousands of 5-star customer reviews. 4 Patriot survival food is not just for natural disasters. In today's world of uncertain supply chains and unpredictable emergencies, it's more important than ever to have a backup plan. Whether it's temporary power outage, a winter blizzard, rising food costs, you can rest easy knowing that you have a reliable source of food to see you through. And right now, you go to 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the emergency food supply kits that are designed to last up to 25 years. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriots survival food. Welcome back, everyone, and there's so much still to unpack, talking about the victim of this giant apparatus being our fundamental rights, our Constitution, and the God-given liberties that exist. And I know that this is a loaded question, George. I'm not pretending that it's an easy answer at all, a yes or no answer. But the question is, in order to keep this apparatus going, there has to be fear. But is it possible that government can prevent every little bad thing from happening? Is that even possible as a government?
No, they didn't. Look, the government, this is what I love about the climate change pagans. We're going to protect the Earth's climate. You can't even put baby formula on the shelf. Okay, so can we just put things in perspective here? Life has risk associated with it. My personal feeling is that risk and being uncomfortable just makes me being comfortable that much more enjoyable. I like to put myself out there in the mountains, snowshoeing in the wintertime, sub-zero temperatures. When I take that warm shower at the end of the day, it feels great. It gives one perspective. This zero defect, zero people shall be killed is killing our Constitution, and which there is a number of people that believe that it should be abolished.
Yeah, and here in New York, I use the example of government can't even fix the roads right. I mean, if you go through New York, you'll just go pothole after pot, and they're not potholes. They're actually like giant craters that swallow your car as you go through them. It's completely ridiculous. But looking at the apparatus that has been created, at some point, it has become weaponized, this political apparatus that we've seen. It's no longer bureaucrats that are focusing on a specific mission. Instead, it's ideologues that have created a mission. Can you explain that to the audience of how an organization like the FBI that was so revered has become so ideological?
Sure. So, testifying once on Capitol Hill doesn't make me an expert, but being involved in the intelligence sphere, both at the National Security Agency and the FBI at some of the highest levels of government, having Barack Obama himself intervening on the Boston Marathon, I understand how these people are to some degree. And they rely on their staffers and they rely on the expert testimony of those that come before them. So when you bring somebody like Director Wray in and he's putting these statistics up, there are some people sitting up there on the dais that, know that it's a bunch of bull, but it serves their purposes. But there are others that it's like, well, if the FBI says that we've seen this, logarithmic increase in white supremacy, it must be happening. And that's pretty much where their thought process stops. There was a recent poll, about white supremacy. Most Americans think that it is on the increase. But then when you ask those same Americans, well, are there any white supremacists in your neighborhood? They say, no, I don't know any. I don't see any. So there's this disconnect. And it's kind of like a quarterback throwing between two defenders. The FBI has managed to rifle that pass in there, both to the American public and to the political class, and continue on with this mission. Because if they don't, then you're looking at a 50% reduction in staff, which means a significant reduction in power.
Absolutely. And when we look at FBI and the way they actually do hiring, how has that impacted the ideological intentions that we see today? What's going on? When you look at old school FBI agents, they are far less ideological. I mean, listen, I was never in the FBI, but I did work in emergency management, Homeland Security when Cuomo was in power. Never once did I say, well, my conservative beliefs won't allow me to, fulfill an order that Cuomo gave our organization. Never once did we do that. Yet today, it seems like many of the people that work for these agencies are very ideological and very political.
Sure. So there's three things here I want to cover. The agent still primarily comes from either the military or a law enforcement background. And if I move them on a spectrum of conservative or liberal, I'd say they're probably maybe a little bit to the left of center, because those are the educational institutions that these people come from. But they're also very much younger. I was a field counselor at the FBI Academy, and the head physician said, we were both in the same Navy Expeditionary Intelligence Combat Command. He remarked to me that the average age had dropped by 5 years and the maturity has dropped by 10. So there is that going on. But what is being missed is, because people, when they think of the FBI, they think of the guns and the badge and the agents. Half the Bureau is intelligence and support personnel. They are coming out of these left-wing institutions. The Bureau has a targeted program going after top-tier institutions, and you're getting these analysts coming out with degrees in political science or criminal justice. The criminal justice ones have aspirations of becoming an agent, but the political science ones don't. They want to be analysts. And their worldview is very left of center. And go ahead.
Just to interrupt you for a minute, because I find that really interesting. A lot of people, and I'm a college professor, you actually teach grad courses at a college. When you talk to people, and no one pretends that liberal bias doesn't exist on college campuses. I mean, it's pretty well known. However, I don't think people recognize the influence and the impact that the left-wing college centers have on the broader society. They focus too much on just the college itself, rather than think about what happens when students graduate and they've been indoctrinated with this stuff. So you witnessed that firsthand with the hiring and who they were bringing in to serve as analysts, correct?
Absolutely. So firsthand, and that's why I wanted to go to the FBI Academy and see how these new analysts and agents are being trained, because I was familiar with the hiring process. I wanted to see what the training process. And you get a group of people, especially on the agent cadre, who are pretty self-enamored from the onset. And you get there and you constantly driving in. You've joined the world's most premier law enforcement agency. I went in the Marine Corps, the world's most foremost fighting, killing, and blowing stuff up agency. But when I went to boot camp, that was not what was communicated to me. They used other choice words to describe me, which are not suitable for your audience.
They destroyed egos, right? You can't go in with an ego, that's for sure.
Right. Yeah, but you're getting people that already show up with an ego, and now you're turning up the dial on it. So people keep on saying that it's only a few bad apples at the top. That is not true. That is not true. That was not a few bad apples at the top that sent out a helo, a boat in the water, and fully tactically equipped 36 agents to go arrest 78-year-old Roger Stone. That is not a few people at the top. The agency is completely corrupted and irredeemable. There's two groups in the bureau today. There are the people that just have their heads down, and I want to get my pension, and hopefully this will pass, and I won't have to do something that I object to. And then there's another group of people that I saw very clearly when Trump fired Comey that are hardcore ideologically bent.
And I think that those are obviously the ones that concern me more. I mean, I wish that the ones that are just a few years away from getting their pensions would speak out more like you're doing. But the reality is that the hardcore ideologically bent ones is what led us to the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. Again, this is a document that doesn't really get talked about much, yet you see the dangers in this document. I brought it up on this podcast time and time again because I see the threat this document poses as someone that has actually written intel reports, as someone that has actually written these counterintelligence manuals. When you look at the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, it talks about anti-government, anti-authority sentiment, that people that express anti-government, anti-authority sentiment are potential domestic terrorists. Now, this immediately raised red flags with me. Again, I've developed documents similar to this, so I know the terminology and the phrases. Now, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the FBI does have a definition for violent, anti-government, anti-authority people. They could be domestic violent extremists, correct?
Yeah, I can't recite that definition off the top of my head, but yes, there is.
No, I'm not saying
everything else in the bureau. It's defined.
Correct, it's defined. So now we're dropping that violent part to just anti-government, anti-authority sentiment, and that's really concerning. Now, people tend to look at issues as separate. They separate everything out. But we have the memo being released in June of 2021. And then just a few months later, we see the National School Boards Association working in concert with the Department of Education and the Department of Justice to get the Department of Justice to start investigating parents that complain at school boards. So at this point, we're now seeing a major morphing of what the term domestic terrorism even means and what extremism even means, correct?
Yeah, it's so broad-based that you can apply it to any group who is not voting the right way. Look, this country, there's a thread that still runs through it of an inherent distrust of government and a desire to live life on their own terms.
The way it's supposed to be.
I thought, but then came 10 days to flatten the curve, wear your mask, take the shot, shut up, or you won't go to work. You won't be allowed to work. And people did it. So I don't know what that change is. You're going to have to get somebody on here a lot smarter than me, and that's a pretty low bar, that explain what occurred in our society that allowed people to willfully sit home and inject their own flesh and blood, their own children, with an experimental vaccine. And not to go down that rabbit hole, but something changed in the American psyche when COVID hit.
Well, I don't think something necessarily changed with the American psyche. I think, again, it points back to our educational institutions where most people today can't even pass a basic citizenship exam. They've never read the Constitution. They don't understand the Constitution. They don't understand its importance. So I was born in 1980 and things were relatively good. I mean, I lived throughout a great time, 80s and 90s, the pinnacle of power. We still had certain issues in society, but for the most part, we were getting along. Society was improving, race relations, everything was improving. And then all of a sudden, we started to see this anti-American sentiment. They want to talk about anti-government, anti-authority sentiment. We began to see anti-American sentiment being pushed into curriculums throughout the country. We began to see less focus on teaching about the Constitution and constitutional principles. And so most Americans aren't even aware what their God-given rights are because they never learned it. And then you have fear as the great motivator. I had a colleague to say to me, when we were going back and forth about the coronavirus, the hell with your Constitution, I want to live. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, wow, I can't believe we're talking someone smart. I mean, it's not like this guy was a moron. And so those words came out of his mouth. And it shows me that the government understood how to use the fear, manipulate the fear in order to expand its powers even further.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Crichton in all his books, that's what he's talking about, using the power of fear to shift people's thinking. You know, people read Jurassic Park or State of Fear and they just think that it's entertainment. He was basically a modern day Mary Shelley.
Yeah, and when it comes to something like January 6th, now, again, nobody defends what took place on January 6th. I got to make that clear for a lot of the dumb people out there that try and misconstrue everything. Nobody defends what took place. Nobody defends any type of vandalism, any type of assaults that have occurred. If people committed actual crimes, then prosecute and charge those people with crimes. However, you don't use an event like January 6th as a catalyst to usurp more and more power and authority. And that's exactly what the FBI did. So can you explain to the audience how the FBI used January 6th as a way to inflate numbers, as a way to increase their power and influence?
So as far as inflating numbers go, like I said, it's not FBI procedure where an event takes place in Washington, D.C., and then people who travel to D.C. from Toledo, Ohio, Seattle, Washington, San Diego, Duluth, Minnesota, that you open up cases all around. But by doing that, and when Ray comes to testify in front of Congress, well, now we have white supremacy all over the country as opposed to basically a bunch of stupid people behaving badly that occurred on January 6th. And I'm 100% with you. There's nothing excusable about that day. If you broke into the Capitol and violated the law and willfully trespassed, engaged in physical altercations, you need to be identified and punished, as do the police officers who are pushing people over balustrades and causing them severe damage. Anyhow.
Correct. So, and you don't overcharge them in order to try and destroy their lives. Again, once again. But equal justice under the law, but that's what they have been doing.
Right. But that's how they manipulate the numbers. And I'm trying to remember, your question was actually almost like two parts. There was one other thing I wanted to bring up. Can you help me out here?
Inflating the numbers and using it to usurp more power and authority going forward.
Sure. So now I'm getting into the realm of speculation, which is really an area that I'm not comfortable with, having been 40 years as an intelligence analyst. But a domestic intelligence service only has one master, the government that created it. And who is the party of government? The Democrats are the party of government. So the FBI is no longer a law enforcement agency. It is a domestic intelligence agency. It has completely transitioned over to that entity now. So they are going to do their very best. And I'm not excusing the FBI's behavior, but they are doing their very best to make happy the party of government.
And that makes sense because without government, then the FBI, that wing of the FBI gets, pushed aside. But there's something that you brought up in the phone conversation that nobody ever talks about. I mean, the FBI is front and center. Everyone is paying attention to the FBI. Everyone is paying to the Department of Justice. A lot of people aren't paying attention, though, to the Department of Homeland Security and their intel gathering unit that originally it's supposed to be within ICE, but yet it has broad power, broad authority that nobody's paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, having done operations with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, they make the FBI look like a group of tier one operators from the U.S. military. They don't have the HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. They have all the same missions that the FBI has. It's almost a mirror organization. And they don't have a domestic investigations operations guide, a DIOG. So they are completely unconstrained by a DIOG, nor do they report to the Department of Justice like the FBI does. So DHS needs to be viewed within the framework of a huge collection apparatus because they have everything from the Coast Guard to Border Patrol to customs. They inject everything that relates to this country. And their analysts and their computing power can synthesize that in direct resources that are not subject to congressional oversight. Nobody wants to touch DHS because DHS was to prevent another American from dying from terrorism. Nobody wants to touch them. But, when the FBI, when gets called on the carpet in Congress, when they speak about sources being embedded, they use slightly different language when they're talking about FBI sources versus that of another agency. So based on that and watching the testimony, a lot of the malfeasance that's being attributed to the FBI, HSI owns a good portion of that as well.
They certainly do. And that's why the growing bureaucracy is always concerning. Now, what gave you the courage to speak out? Why did you decide that you had enough, that you were going to speak out against the abuses that you were witnessing, that we've all been witnessing? Isn't it so much easier to just keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and live your life?
Have you been talking to my wife? I would love to be able to reach around and pat myself on the back. I didn't do anything special. I saw the abuses that took place on January 6th when Bank of America data mined their customer base. I was front and center to the exchanges going back and forth between the Washington field office and our own office, demanding that we open up cases without predication. And I would like to say that I picked up the phone that day and called Congressman Jordan's office. I didn't. It pains me to say this because it's an embarrassment, but I'm like, you know what? This eventually will see the light of day. Somebody will address it. And I retired a little bit earlier than I wanted to because of the vaccine pressure. And I was already retired, and the .edu threat tag came out when they started going after parents. And at that point, I had had enough because it became clear to me that not only was not someone else going to step forward and do it, there was no one else that was going to step forward and do it unless I did it. And that's why I picked up the phone. I'd like to say I joined the Navy Reserve in response to 9/11. I joined a year and a half before 9/11. I'm kind of like the accidental whistleblower. I'm the accidental combat veteran. I don't know. I did the right thing, but I didn't suffer some of the consequences that some of the other whistleblowers have.
What has been the reaction to you speaking out? I mean, are former colleagues, do they still talk to you? Did they shut you out? Are they agreeing with you behind the scenes? I mean, I have a few former FBI agents that I speak with. They can't believe what's going on. They're sickened by what they see. But there's a lot within the FBI that actually supports some of this.
Yeah, I'm down to two. I have two FBI friends left after over 10 years in the office, running all three national security programs. I'm down to two people that'll talk to me.
That's stunning. Stunning. And it shows you where we are as a society.
They're afraid for their jobs. It's so easy to crush somebody in the FBI to keep them from coming forward. The security process is so easy to just pull somebody's clearance, based on, well, we need to reinvestigate, some things have surfaced. No, we can't share them with you. So you basically have sidelined someone now who cannot look for a job and who can't work cases because they don't have a clearance. And they're sitting out there unemployed.
And why do you think Congress hasn't been? I mean, they're the ones tasked with the power of oversight. I mean, let's be honest. You and I, we're limited in what we can do. We could expose it. We could discuss it. We could highlight it. But we're limited. I mean, Congress is the one that's tasked with the power of oversight. And I know this is speculation, but why do you think Congress hasn't been more aggressive in exercising their power of oversight? I mean, it almost seems as if these agencies are beholden to no one.
They're not accountable to anyone. Director Wray has not lost 1 minute's sleep. He actually testified in front of Congress. I'm sorry, I have a previous commitment I need to get to, which was to abuse a government-issued plane so that he could go on vacation in the Adirondacks. This is the chutzpah on these people. They don't care. These agencies don't care. And I didn't just make that up. Anybody can go out and Google it themselves and find out that what I said is accurate. He did it. They don't care. I think that over half of the people in Congress and the Senate on the Republican side actually still believe that at some point in time we'll get our turn. No, you will not. The Democrats are not going to cede power. They've got total control now. And like Senator Schumer said, when you run afoul of the intelligence community, they got 8 ways to Sunday to get back at you. And that's where we're at today. I think that half of them still think they're going to get their turn to wield this kind of power, and the other half are absolutely terrified. I really do believe that, based on evidence.
Well, they have good reason to be. I mean, if you could spy on sitting members of the Senate Intelligence Committee and nothing happens to you, if you could sit there and launch an investigation into a presidential candidate and then a president based on all BS and false information, lying to FISA courts and getting away with it, and then just over the last couple of years, the FBI illegally accessed the NSA's repository on Americans time and time again. No consequence for that.
Hundreds of thousands of violations.
It's crazy. And so they do believe they could operate with impunity. What do you hope to see?
Let's just make this, I'm 5 years old and I'm sitting on Santa's lap, and then we'll go to reality. I would hope to see an end, a breakup of the DHS. They need to disband the FBI. The component parts of it that still serve a purpose need to be kept, like their forensics capabilities, their technical capabilities. But with the laws that they're written now, with the connectivity that we have across the 50 states, the FBI has long since outlived its usefulness. So that needs to end. At a very minimum, now I'm no longer 5, I'm an adult. At a very minimum, the FBI's intel program needs to stop. All those people need to be let go. They all need to go. Not somewhere else within government. They need to go. To quote Barack Obama and Joe Biden, they can explore their career's opportunity by learning how to write code. I don't care. They need to get out. They're subverting the Constitution, and that's exactly how I view them.
And unfortunately, the mission was to uphold the Constitution. That's the scary aspect to this whole apparatus that has been built out over the last 20 years.
Yeah, but over the last 20 years, the Constitution was written by evil white men. Our country was founded for the perpetuity, to perpetuate the slave trade. People don't. The group that we have now, 20 years after 9/11, don't even believe in the Constitution. So no, it's a hot mess. And quite frank, to be blunt, I don't see a soft landing in our future.
No, neither do I. I don't think there's enough people that are even aware of what's going on. They're too busy paying attention to the latest, pop craze or what's going viral on TikTok without even realizing that that's just nothing more than an intelligence gathering mission and a way to just poison our culture. And unfortunately, the situation will get worse before it begins to get better, if it does. But there are important aspects of bringing this to light for people to realize what is taking place on government, how far we've deviated from the missions, what should be done or can be done. And I think you're doing a great service for the American public by speaking out. So I really appreciate you coming on, George. And I think it's such an important conversation that we need to continue to have.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
George is a remarkable individual, and like I said before when I was introducing him, he has served this country with honor and distinction. He continues to serve it to this day. We need more people like him to speak up and speak out against the abuses of power they are witnessing. I don't want to see a politically weaponized bureaucracy that pushes a left-wing point of view or a right-wing point of view, a Republican point of view or a Democrat point of view. These institutions need to be above reproach, and when they abuse their power, then it's time to remove that power from them. So we have to pay attention. Now I'm going to continue to focus on this abuse of power. On Wednesday, I want to exclusively focus on the Department of Homeland Security, and I am going to read an astonishing email that I received from a colleague of mine that I used to work with, who I have an enormous amount of respect for, because he also breaks it down in what's going wrong. So you're not going to want to miss that episode. Again, if you found the contents of this episode informative, make sure that you leave a 5-star rating. Take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. Make sure to visit the P.A.S. Report website and share this episode with your family and friends and on social media. I want to thank you for joining me. Have a happy and safe July 4th, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.